Point Press Parallel. Jason, welcome. Glad to have you here, man.
Oh my goodness, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Great. Well, we kind of had to move things around a little bit because things are going crazy. We were talking before we went live about just COVID. You're a teacher. My
Yep.
kid's school year got pushed back a week, and then just went crazy. The school district had no idea what they were doing, so I had to rearrange some stuff. So thank you for being flexible with me and still getting you on here. I'm excited.
Oh, again, my pleasure. Yes, everybody's schedule is kind of nuts right now, so I'm certainly not pulling some. I'm not a famous person. I'm not a holier than thou. I'm not a soapbox person. As long as it works for you, it works for me.
Great, great. Well, you have a your debut comic, Parallel, out, but tell us a little bit about yourself. What's your background? How did you get to this point of being comic book author, Jason Douglas?
So I'm born and bred in Michigan, and educationally trained to be a teacher. But comic books have been a part of my life since I was young, and in fact played a major role. I started off as an elementary school teacher for the first 13 years of my career, and played a major role in my classroom. In fact, my love of comics, I literally just dropped right into my elementary school classrooms because I found, and this is kind of in the years before it became really almost mainstream and popular to do so. They became like this brilliant bridge for reluctant readers
Mm-hmm.
and below grade level readers, right?
Yep.
I found especially with boys, but like if it was a reluctant reader or a below grade level reader, and like you were doing like your silent reading time or something, to save face, even with like a 10-year-old, to save the embarrassment of knowing that you couldn't read what you were quote unquote supposed to be reading.
Mm-hmm.
You would catch them reading something, you would catch them reading a big fat Harry Potter, which was grade levels beyond, sometimes upside down, sometimes backwards. And if you handed them traditional literature that was on grade level for them, it was, you might as well just be publicly shaming them.
Right.
However, you put a comic, any comic, grade level appropriate comic in front of them, and the shame melted away. And so right there, that was enough for me as an educator, right? To be like, okay, let's just fill the classroom. And I did. And then I went even a little bit further and started doing some research and finding the studies that prove that honestly, comics have just as much worth. And sometimes as far as brainwaves go and like how much focus a student has on computers, because there's a different part of the brain that follows the narrative prose and then the narrative in the pictures, and it actually fires up more parts of your brain than just reading a normal book. So like, I was armed for when the naysayers in those early days came after you and said, comics in the classroom kind of thing. So it's always played a role in my life. And in the back of my head for a long time was always that kind of latent dream of making something your own. I think a lot of comic readers think, oh, my story would be, and I am very much just like everybody else in never acting on it. Until the day came and there's some catalysts that kind of kicked it off, and I decided it was finally time. Several decades after the dream first manifested, for sure.
I love all that. I love that you were an advocate because there's actually, I mean, you probably know this as an educator, there's actually studies now that show
Oh yeah,
reading comics is fantastic for learning. Fantastic.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I love that.
I actually found like it was a very early study, like early 2000s, like I think out of UNC Chapel Hill, that kind of backed me up on that, because it was still, I mean, I was doing that. I was going, you like this. So like Scholastic had just gotten into the game, right? They were
Mhm.
reprinting Bone, which is a poster behind me, reprinting Bone in color, and that was in the room, and some other good stuff there. But I was actually going and digging through like dollar bins and finding like beat up Bronze and Silver Age issues,
Uh-huh.
for like a quarter, for $1, taking them into school, cutting them up, running them through the laminator. And then I don't know if you remember from school, like when you would make your own books, those little,
Yeah,
that
they had
machine
to,
that made those little plastic
yeah,
binding
you had
things
to
on the
feed it
side,
all through.
and like
Yeah.
turn it into indestructible. Cause like even a regular trade paperback would only last. I rebought Bone in my elementary school classroom every year or two, like all the trades, because people would go through them and they
Right.
just get shredded. And those laminated with the bindings would last for years. So like
Mhm.
they'd even get their old school floppies from like the 70s and 60s, which was pretty cool too.
Yeah. You just, we'll talk about this in a minute. You just sparked, I used to tell people my first comic book was a Superman comic book. But I'm incorrect. You just sparked a memory in me, and we'll get to that in a minute.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
So you've always been a comic fan, and so this is when we'll get to it. Do you remember your first comic book as a kid?
So yes, and we need a little bit of context for this. So my gateway was actually comic strips, right? Mm-hmm. Sunday Color supplement, right? When I was real little, I was a huge Peanuts fan. Started reading Far Side before I understood what the jokes were.
Yeah.
But I also grew up in a family where I was the oldest child, and I didn't have my guy, as Mark Maron says on WTF. Like, I didn't have my guy. I didn't have my older sibling. I didn't have an older cousin. I didn't have that weirdo down the street who said, like, this is what's cool, you know?
Uh-huh.
My parents were very much not cool people. My mother, okay, I'm so sorry for calling her out on this, but it needs to be known. The world needs to know. In 1965, my mother turned down a free ticket to go see the Beatles in Detroit.
No.
She had to stay home and wash her hair. Yes. So basically the point of me telling you that is I came to just about everything a little bit late, right? I came to the music I ended up loving, the movies I ended up loving, certainly the books and the authors and the comics I ended up loving later than most. Like, I didn't really get into comics until 12 or 13 years old, but I do remember that the very first comic that I read was a reprint, and I wouldn't even know that it was a comic book at the time. It was an X-Men mass market trade paperback, so like a reprint in like the little ones that could fit in your back pocket.
Yeah,
and it was reprinting X-Men 123 through 128, I think. So like their first encounter with Arcade, and then the Proteus storyline, Moira McTaggart's son, right?
Yeah.
And that's from 79 or something. This book I probably got like 86, 87. You know, I'm like 9-10 years old, and it was literally black and white and only 2 panels per page.
Oh, wow.
And just like this big, thick book. And so even my first introduction to comics was very unorthodox because it wasn't even properly formatted.
Yeah.
The pacing that you would have wanted, the panel size was uniform. And then I got this little stack where you could like go to, up here in the Midwest, Meijer or Kmart, and you could get these little 3-packs, right? And there was my first one had a G.I. Joe in it. It had, Fantastic Four number 302, I think, where Johnny loses his flame. And then there was some spectacular Spider-Man where he goes to England and fights these really lame villains called Night and Fog. And so a few like that. And then I dove in, right? And then I've got like a very obsessive nature, and I'm a completist. And so like once I was in, and it's like the early 90s, and the collector's boom explodes, and I literally perfectly split my fandom in half. I was half collector and half reader, right? So I'm still looking for number 1 issues and fancy foil covers, and the fact that Wolverine number 50 has those claw marks across the top was like the greatest thing ever.
Right.
But at the same time, the other half of my brain, the one that appreciates storytelling a little bit more than like the thrill of the hunt, the Valiant universe became my jam. And literally, like in the very early 90s, it was my entire pull list at my local comic shop. And every Valiant title, I'd ride my bike up there every week. Not apparently smart enough to have like slightly more sophisticated storytelling at a young age and appreciate it, but not smart enough to take a backpack with me. So like you can just picture me like riding my bike like the 4 miles back with the bag, like awkwardly clutched in the handlebar, and hopefully I won't have to brake. It was horrible. I was so dumb. But Valiant, and then the one that really kicked it off. And in fact, I've also got that kind of typical story where I kind of fell away from comics for about 9 years. I took that hiatus in the mid-teenage years and didn't come back until my 20s. But the only 2 books, and the one that I kind of discovered early, the only 2 books that followed with me throughout that time and I reread were Neil Gaiman's Sandman and Art Spiegelman's Mouse. So, like titans of the storytelling genre, just then, World Fantasy Award winners, and obviously Pulitzer Prize for Mouse. So that was kind of my bridge during my hiatus, and then I've been a nut ever since.
That's awesome. So, like I was saying earlier, first, I say this almost every interview. It's so interesting to me. Everybody different first book. I haven't
Yeah.
heard the same first book twice, and it's just so cool the different avenues that people get into this hobby or this way of life.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
But so my first comic book that I thought I remembered getting was a Superman comic book from my mom. We lived outside Chicago, and Spring Hill Mall outside Chicago had Superman days. There's apparently, I don't know why, maybe I think it coincided with maybe Superman 3 coming out. I don't know. But they had Superman days, and they gave out free copies of this Superman comic book. So
Okay.
I actually still have that one. But you sparked a memory in me. My actual first comic book I got from my uncle, who's a teacher, and he gave me a copy of Illustrated Classics, Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven.
Nice.
Yeah. So that was actually my
wow.
first comic book.
Yeah.
So I don't have that one anymore. That got lost somewhere along the way, but thank you for sparking that memory in me.
Oh, yeah, that's amazing. I love that. That's great.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk Parallel. Let's talk your
Yeah.
comic now. It's recently published, Source Point Press. If you're watching on YouTube, Twitter, or Facebook, you can see the cover, the standard cover on the left side of your screen there of Jason's debut graphic novel, Parallel. Let's talk about it. Break it down for us. So, where'd you get the idea? What was the path of bringing it to life? Let's talk Parallel.
So I'm gonna get this terrible wordplay out of the way up front, but there are actually pretty significant parallels between the gestation of the story and how it actually came to be, right? So I mean, thematically at its core, even though it's wrapped as a story in this kind of dark and frankly sometimes creepy sci-fi construct, I mean, at its core, it's all about that existential dread of time passing, right? Of dreams deferred and lost opportunities and the second chances that most of us don't get, and how that can lead to, depending on your personal experience with it, depression or anxiety or a sense of loss, as those dreams that you thought you had forever to accomplish when you were 18 to 22, and you wake up 5 years later, or in my case 20 years later, and it's like, well, I guess that's gone. I mean, I have been experiencing that for a long time, because I've always had this dream, and it was never even something that I almost pursued. It was just like this nagging kind of itch at the back of my brain. Here's this thing I love. Here's this thing I would love to do. And yet life just keeps on happening, right? So you've got that going. And then at the same time, I am writing. So like part of my job that I took on in the elementary school and then in the middle school was I ran drama clubs. And in both places, we had zero budget, meaning I couldn't afford to buy a play from a major publisher to put on with these kids. So I was like, well, I guess I just need to write my own. And so I started writing skits and plays and kind of cutting my teeth that way for like these kids. And I did it for a long enough time, and we were successful enough with it and putting them on. I put a couple out and they got published. And so it was like one of these things where I was practicing. I was getting better at something, like working up to this thing that I wasn't even planning on doing. And then the catalyst came when actually I've been teaching long enough where I was talking to some former students who are now literally the age that Landon, the main character of Parallel, is in the book, like pushing 30. And they vocalized in their own words what society now calls the quarter life crisis, right? This idea of oh man, what happened? Like I'm 28, I'm 29, and I'm thinking of one student in particular. Like I'm not in Chicago dancing right now, right? Like at a studio, right? I am not in New York pursuing that stage career that I was absolutely sure the day I graduated from college was going to happen. I took X job, I got into Y relationship. I made this decision based on the practicality of the time, or the idea, that universal concept that I think a lot of us can relate to, that it's always easier to do nothing than something, and how easy it is to rationalize that there's always tomorrow. Well, tomorrow leads to tomorrow leads to tomorrow. As Robert Frost said, and eventually you're 30 and maybe you don't get that shot. And that was like the key. So you've got like that existential longing and dread that I'm experiencing. the fact that I've kind of got some writing experience at this point, and then this catalyst of former students just saying, oh, well, here's my story. And it just kind of popped. And so a couple of summers ago, I decided to take a break from writing a new play, and I was going to write a comic script instead. Now, I got to tell you up front that there is a lot of blissful ignorance in me attempting that, because my complete naivety and kind of lack of frame of reference, I think, is kind of what saved me from doing what ended up being a very, very hard blood, sweat, and tears task. I did not know what a different animal, and frankly, how much harder it was going to be to write a comic script than it was to write a play. I mean, I was muscle memory at that point. You know what I mean? And just structurally, it's different. I mean, literally, how many indents you put on a line for the kind of thing that you're writing it's a vastly different type of writing. Not to mention, it takes things that you need to know about prose and combines it with things you need to know about film, and the pacing and the size of panels and everything down to, you've got to be aware of, do you want a page turn here, or do you want the reveal to be on a facing page? There's like 100 more things I had to think about at once.
Right.
And I think the blissful ignorance of not being aware of that up front, much less the what you do now that you have a story, like the getting out in the world thing, I'm almost positive. I mean, if you think about it this way, right? It took me almost a couple of decades to even take the first step. If I had known the kind of overwhelming numbers that are stacked against you, the odds that are stacked against you of actually creating something and put it out in the world, I probably would have put it back away for another, couple of decades, if not forever.
Wow. That's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm airing an interview. We actually did it on Friday, but I'm airing an interview tomorrow night with author of It's a Living. He's a freelance. His name's Christian. I can't pronounce his last name, I don't think. I don't want to butcher it. Sorry, Christian. Just he's the artist, and he talked a little bit in the interview about how many writers just don't know what they're doing. They just want to write a comic book, and then they bring it to an artist and like, here. So that's, you're speaking truth there. The beast of writing a comic book is very different than anything else anybody's written.
Well, I mean, that's something that, even though I didn't know how to do it, I was keenly aware of from the jump, right? I mean, I had the story. I knew what I wanted to say. Most of the beats were there. Certainly the underlying themes were there, right? Like, what was important to me to get across was there. The characters were there. But having written stuff before, I knew how important, and reading so many comics myself, right? Like being such a fan myself, I knew that it wasn't just a matter of writing.
Right.
So like my first step was an exhaustive internet research, just finding different examples of physically what a script looks like.
Yeah.
And then actually playing, like, I went back to like old trade paperbacks of mine, like Ed Brubaker is famous for in the back of his comics putting like that back matter in there and whatever. And you'll buy a trade, and for the extra couple of bucks you're paying, there's like a script back there or something like that. And I'm just like pouring over those, not even necessarily just for the structure of it, but for the, how do you transfer what is a raw scene into the pacing of panels and layout and size and page turns and things like that. So just like learning that, it was daunting, but again, not having the knowledge before I started really, I think, saved me, because you just dive in and it's like, oh, well, I guess that's the next thing. And you're thinking about a dozen things at once. It's an amazing kind of experience. And I think one of the biggest kind of letdowns about how comics still are not accepted, at least not in the United States, at least not in most Western cultures. There's other places in Europe where it is, as being an equal footing artistically as a lot of other print mediums, is there's actually more things that are going into account when you're putting it together than almost anything else.
Yep. That's right. So you've talked a little bit about where you got the idea, and I don't want to give it away, too much away. I want people to go buy your book, but it's kind of that universal concept that gets used a lot of this kind of half-life or quarter-life, in this case, crisis, but in a completely new way. I mean, I love the premise of kind of parallel and where paths diverge and the choices we make. I really loved it. You know, I get sent a lot of books, and not everybody gets an interview, and based on their book. But I really loved the ending of your book.
Well, thank you.
Again, no spoilers, but just it was not the ending I was expecting, but that made me love it because I wasn't expecting it. So, how did you get to that point of choosing that ending?
Well, I think, okay, without giving too much away.
Yeah.
Like you said, something that I really, really, really like in the stories that I consume, whether they're in comic form or film or anything else, I actually like rereadability and rewatchability, right? As much as I enjoy my serialized content and being propelled to the next episode or the next issue or whatever, something that's going to stay with me forever is the thing that I want to reread, whether it's immediately after I put it down or the next day or 5 years later. It doesn't matter to me. So I was always aware of that. And one of the ways to do that is to leave some ambiguity, right? And there's a lot of ambiguity in this book where when Landon starts seeing and hearing the visions and the sounds of this other version of him who's lived the life that he could have had, and the offers are being made that, hey, it's not too late for you, just like you thought it was. Right. Hey, as long as you do this, and this for me, and then we should note that the things that you've got to do to get this second chance are probably not in your best interest mentally and physically in the here and now.
Right.
And as that tension builds and those crescendos and we get those peaks and valleys, especially in the second half of the book, I think one of my favorite bits of feedback that I've gotten from people who have read it so far is they'll go back and read it again and interpret it the opposite of the way that they interpreted it the first time.
Really?
On this page, they were with Landon, that it's really happening. On the next page, they were with the other people in their lives, in his life, that were saying it's clearly all in your head. And then they change their opinion about it the next time. And a lot of it's in the script, but I've got to give Adam Ferris, my artist, a shout out. I don't even know how he did this, but like, he can draw ambiguity. Like, I don't even know what I just said out loud. Like, I don't even know what those words don't even make sense as I say them, but he can draw ambiguity. And the coolest thing, Easter eggs is not exactly the right analogy, but there are a bunch of clues in his art throughout, especially when the two Landons are interacting, to kind of let you decide, which way it's going to be. I'll tell you this, again, without giving too much away about the ending. So my very first reaction from a reader interpreted the ending as very dark and very hopeless.
Really?
Now, I can tell by your face you are on the other side of
that.
Now, the next 5 after that found it very hopeful. But the idea that you can look at that last splash page, at that panel, and for anybody who's seen it before, and for like people who have a copy, you look at Landon in the center of the frame, make sure you're paying close attention to what's on either side of him, right, in the reflections of the glass. And there's multiple ways that you can interpret that. Wow. And I like that because, once whatever was in my head at inception, as soon as it's out in the world, and I've always believed this about any kind of creative process, right? Like when I do poetry with middle schoolers, it's like, and we're trying to make it not boring and interesting, and we're breaking something down. We're breaking down, "Oh, Captain, my Captain," or a bit of Robert Frost or something. It's like any interpretation is good, because literally once it's out of the artist's hands, it's up to you to decide what it is. And I definitely was aware of that and wanted to make sure that was something you were able to do. I wasn't going to hold anybody's hand. And then I think it plays to the overall theme too. And you talked about the universality of it. I mean, there's this irony. If the underlying theme is about, time passing and your lost opportunities and do you get a second chance, whatever pain we feel as that's happening to us, we feel it in isolation, whether that turns into depression or angst or anxiety or a doom and gloom outlook. We tend to experience that solo, alone, and in isolation. And the greatest irony of that is just about everybody around you is going through something similar at one other time in their life. So like my other favorite feedback from the book so far is, yes, I love it when people are like, ooh, the sci-fi and it's twist and it's dark and oh, that scene and it was, and then the thing at the top of the stairs, again, not giving anything away. People love it. Great. But it's the people who are like, oh, that was about me. That was like, I totally know. Oh my God. Because when I was 18, I knew I was going to be, and and like people making connections with that idea, that's what makes my heart swell, I think.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I'm going to have to go back and reread it now to see if I can interpret it with hopelessness at the end. I don't know that I can, but I'm going to have to pop it open when we get off here and see. So what was the point? You got the script written. What was the point of getting, or what was the path of getting it to SourcePoint Press?
So definitely not your typical thing. I mean, this is 21st century, and most, especially indie comics, but literally the vast majority of comics are, at least in some form or another, self-funded to begin with, right? Mm-hmm. And this comes into, this is not me out of any kind of confidence or arrogance. This was me out of lack of frame of reference. I wrote that first 32 pages in a bubble, in a literal bubble, where it was just me, it was computer, and just with no other idea than the catalyst had kicked in, the impetus was there, and I had to do it. Okay. But as soon as I hit that midway point, I started thinking a little bit broader, like, well, what do you do next? And my first step was, again, kind of out of ignorance, is I kind of poked around online and like, how do you submit it to publishers? Like, how does this even work?
Right.
And I'll tell you, it was daunting and fairly disconcerting when you go publisher after publisher, big, medium, and small. The vast majority do not want unsolicited submissions, right? And even if they take them, they mostly want your art. They definitely don't want a script, right?
Right.
Maybe a pitch and some pages, but they don't want 32 pages of a Word document, you know? And again, out of complete ignorance, I wasn't put off on that. If I knew that my odds had just shrunk down to some minuscule amount, I probably would have been like, oh, I guess that's it. And instead, all I did was I literally walked into my classroom and I grabbed, if you can remember back to your school days, I grabbed a manila envelope, like a file folder, made a bunch of copies of the 32 pages, a cover letter, character bios, some story beats for the second half, that kind of thing. Put it all together with, check this out, pulled open my drawer, beautiful, cute little color paper clips. I mean, like, it's as adorable and nauseating as it sounds. And I took this stack, little graphic on the front, for like, word art or something. And I took it to Motor City Comic Con, my local, big yearly show. And it was just with the idea that I would walk up to, well, that looks like a publisher, and not just, and hand them the thing. And the first booth I saw, which was huge and attractive and lovely, because they are a powerhouse at cons, was SourcePoint Press.
Wow. And
they got their start in Michigan as well. And I locked eyes with the first person behind the tables that I saw, and not because I had any kind of kismet premonition, but because he had the most glorious red beard you've ever seen in your life. And I walked up and I was just like, hello. And it just happened to be Travis McIntyre, the co-founder, president, and editor-in-chief of SourcePoint. And I handed him the thing and we talked. And like, he's kind of giving me this side eye look the whole time. That's kind of, he's like questioning me. He's like, are you trying to pitch me a comic as if it's 1971? Like, I don't he clearly nobody had handed him a paper copy of anything for like a decade, but I did. And he took it home and he read it that night. And I came back to the con the next day and he's like, okay, here's what's going to happen. You're going to go home and you're going to write me a second half. Because in my head, again, I'm a comic fan. So I saw like 3-4 issues, right? And he's like, nope, it's a one shot at 64 pages. Give me a second half. You can do that, right? And I immediately said, absolutely yes. The same way that like an actor in an audition, when they're like, you can ride a horse, right? And they're like, yes, I can. They've never even seen a horse. I was like, yes, I can do that. And then was like, I don't know if I can do that, but I'm going to try. Now, the coolest thing about the next part of the process was I got hooked up with Adam at that point. And Adam sent me character studies and he sent me some sample pages and I got to do that. Oh my God, like a dream for writers. I got to write for an artist for the second half. So there's twists and turns. I mean, most of it was already there, but there's things that are a little darker or things that are paced a little bit different because I knew Adam could do it. Wow. And then of course he blows that all out of the water anyway. But I'll tell you, and then the process is, it's indie comics. It's slow. There's a lot more blood, sweat, and tears. For the advantages that indie comics have of not being beholden to the pushing sales every single month like a Marvel or DC, the drawback, of course, is you also don't have that 80 years of infrastructure that can just turn it out like that. There might be more love and a family feel to it, but it's also a more it's a bigger, better process to get it done. But the nerd in me, the longtime comic fan in me, got to then piece by piece with enough time in between each step to process it, got to totally nerd out when the first completed page came in. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or when Justin Birch, the letterer, invites me on a FaceTime call to watch him letter a couple of the pages.
Oh,
And I was just like,
wow.
oh, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. And then the book like comes alive right then. And then Casey Pierce, like superstar of Source Point Press, writes the foreword for me. And it's like, don't tell anybody this, but it's better than the whole book. But, okay.
I did enjoy the foreword.
So all those pieces got, so like as the process moves along over like literally 2 years, I got to not only enjoy it from a personal satisfaction of here's something I created going through the process, but like somebody who's such a longtime fan of the medium itself, getting the backstage look and it's for the thing that was in your brain was magical.
That's awesome.
Absolutely magical.
That's awesome. So kind of Gustavo, I think I'm saying that right, on YouTube said, hey, what advice would you give when first trying to give flaws to your character? Like how to make it believable but not too flawed. Got any advice?
I think, so when I'm thinking about this and I'm thinking about the thing that I've been working on recently too, the more hyper aware you are of forcing something. Like if you are trying to be ultra conscious of giving a character a flaw, to be specific, probably the less genuine it's going to be coming across. There's one of the oldest cliches in writing is write what you know, right? And the reality is the people you know and probably the person you are has flaws. And so like as long as you are writing a character who is, whether you're giving them superpowers or something other natural, it doesn't really matter. As long as you're writing a real character, those flaws will come. And like when you're writing dialogue or writing a scene, like you make it as real as you can. I think that's something I learned with like writing for the stage too, because you have so many fewer tricks. To do. I mean, you're literally putting these two humans on stage together and making them talk to each other. If you don't make that as realistic as possible, how would they actually say that thing? And because they're human beings and because your characters you're imbuing with that reality, they're going to automatically have flaws.
Right.
And that's not to say you can't build something in there, but there's pettiness in Landon. I think when you look at like the first half of the book, you look at Claire, his wife, and she comes across almost as a two-dimensional villain.
Right. Yeah. And I thought that too.
But in my opinion, so there's this big chunk of time between my writing the first half and the second half. I end up, and not everybody agrees with this, but I end up with a lot of sympathy for her by the end of the book.
Me too, actually.
Because like I look at Landon in that second half, and there's some hard truths. I mean, he's doing the a heightened sad sack thing in the beginning, and you tend to be with him, but man, in that second half you can see like the toll it's taking on the people around him. And there's a bit of, I mean, it is not woe is me. A lot of his troubles are self-inflicted by the choices that he made, and there's a bit of destruction in his wake.
I agree that at the beginning I was kind of like, man, I don't really want this woman to be the villain, and then as you read, it's like, oh wait, she's not. She's just doing her thing. And it's through Landon's point of view that you're seeing her as the villain, more or less.
Oh, absolutely. I'm with you. So like write real people, write real characters. Nobody's perfect, and those flaws are going to show up. Those warts will show.
I love it. You following any other indie titles right now?
So, there's a couple of Source Point books and creators I want to shout out. So like my friend Casey Pierce, who's my friend and my mentor, and she wrote the foreword, as I said, volume 2 of Nora is going on right now, which is a hit, and I love it. She's so good. No Heroine, anything by Frank Gogol is amazing. And then my editor, Bob Sally, holy cow, Bob Sally is Broken Gargoyles is crushing it right now. So those are my Source Point books that I'm really digging right now. Anything by Jeff Lemire. I am reading, whether it's mainstream or it's indie or self-owned. And I've got to give shout out to Eric Powell, because like holy cow, somebody who started small, hit it big, and has now never lost integrity and is now back to Albatross Funny Books and still putting out The Goon. after kind of getting screwed over by the industry in a couple of ways, and still like has not given up his artistic integrity. Mad shouts to him. I am much more a loyalist to a handful of writers, and will follow them wherever they go. But those are a few for sure.
Awesome. Very good. I love those. So I'm not sure Parallel is really a book that you would do a crossover with, but you can take this any way you want to. There's no right or wrong answer. If you could do a crossover between your title.
This is the best question because there's a really simple answer.
Okay, so crossover between Parallel and any other title.
No, this is done. This is so easy because this is the best answer because it doesn't matter what the other title is as long as Mike Mignola's Hellboy shows up in your book. It works, right? Because like he just comes in there and he just and he says "son of a" at least once, and something, you know, he punches something bigger than him, and that's it. It doesn't matter how serious, how different genre it is, how mainstream, how it doesn't matter if Hellboy shows up. That is the best crossover. So
that's true.
Like without even missing a beat. Mignola draws and writes Hellboy popping in there, and Landon's like, "What's going on?" And he's like, "Oh," and he punches the other Landon, and then he's out. I don't even care if it's 2 panels. That would be the ideal crossover.
And it would make sense in Hellboy, and it would make sense in Parallel also. I mean,
exactly.
You win
right
that
answer.
You win that answer out of all my interviews. All right. So what's next for you? Is there going to be Parallel 2, or you said you're working on another book? What's next?
Well, I think Parallel's that one shot. I think it's self-contained. I don't know where it would go next. I like where it is, and personally, as much as I love my X-Men, the things that have stuck with me the most over the years are the self-contained things, the things that do have a beginning, middle, and end, and you can go back and read it and you want to. So I don't necessarily foresee anything in the future for that. However, I am working on something new. It's called Jane American. It's actually with the editors being considered right now at Source Point Press. So if you like Parallel, put pressure on them to make sure they publish my next thing.
Yeah.
It's a post-World War II story. It is in the way that Parallel is really about X, Y, and Z, and yet wrapped in the sci-fi construct. Jane American is really about the themes of isolation, about being other, about being ostracized because you do not fit into the norm. But it's wrapped in a superhero construct. Not in a world of superheroes, but our character at 12 years old, when her father dies in World War II, kind of gets the explosion of strength and speed and agility, and then has to hide it. And by 15, in 1946, when the soldiers come home, and now her mother, who's the sole breadwinner for the family, Rosie the Riveter, has to go home. All the African Americans working in the factories have to go back home, and there aren't jobs for them anymore. Here's this young girl who could do the work of 10 of those returning soldiers, but like, how do you make your way in the world and keep that secret? And inspired not only by and slightly based on, not really the superhero part, my late grandmother and some of the things she went into right after the war, but definitely even in the 21st century, all these students who still come through my room, and you think 60 to 80 years removed, the world has completely moved on. And yes, we are no longer here. Yes, we are closer to here in equality, but we're still here. And I still witness those students, and it breaks my heart every year when, whether it be race or religion or gender or sexuality or you name it, something that makes them perceived different to outside society, they then internalize that, and they are not the person they should be or feel comfortable being the person they be. And it breaks my heart all the time, and this goes out to them. My favorite thing about this story, though, I think, other than the themes that mean a lot to me, there's a lot of personal history involved, too. It actually, a big part of it takes place in a real-life factory in Plymouth, Michigan, my hometown, where there was this wire factory that during World War II got the government contract and got converted to make these things called Marston mats. And even if you haven't heard of Marston mats, you know what they are. These are the long strips of punctured metal that they use to make the temporary runways in Europe and the Pacific. So you could just clear a bit of jungle and make a runway wherever you needed it. And my great-grandfather, I found records, actually worked in that factory.
Oh, wow.
And and it was one of the only 2 factories in the country. There's another one in Alabama that held on to the contract after the war because Berlin Airlift came up and they still needed to be making them and stuff like that. And there's even to the town to the south, there was a neighborhood, still holds the same name today. It was one of the first southeastern Michigan government subsidized neighborhoods to help with the Great Migration, when African Americans came up from the South and were populating those factories during World War II, and that was like that was the neighborhood, and all this kind of stuff comes into play as 1946. You turn to that post-war thing where everything's supposed to go back to normal after all of these people got a taste of workforce equality, and now it's taken away again. And then the fun of she's also hiding the fact that she can probably bench press like 50 of those Marston mats, where a grown man can maybe lift one. And so I'm really excited about that, and hope that they pick that up and publish that. But that's what I'm working on right now.
That's awesome. Hey, Source Point Press talking to you right now. Just do it. Just publish it. Just, what are you waiting for? Because I'm sure they're watching right now. Okay. There's a lot of people out there who are like you and have this idea of a book in their head, and they just don't know the path of bringing it to life. So if you could give one piece of advice to other people who are wanting to create their first indie book, what would it be?
Okay, this is going to sound like a trite and pat answer, but because of the source of it, you can believe me, and then I'll back it up. Because Neil Gaiman himself told me this. Heard him say it in a speech, and then I got to talk to him afterwards, and he told me it again. And this was before I was even fully pursuing it myself. And he very famously has said multiple occasions that if you want to write a book, if you want to write a comic, how do you do it? How do you write a comic? Well, his answer is write a comic. And it sounds trite, but it is true. Because I think I mentioned this earlier, it's always easier to do nothing than something, right? And it doesn't even matter. The way he explained it to me is you just have to do it. And the great thing is that once you do it, it'll now exist. And it doesn't matter if it's good, it doesn't matter if it's bad. But what he promised, he looked right at me, he promised me, he said, I can't promise you what happens if you write something, right? It could die on the vine right there. It could become the greatest thing ever. It could satisfy your itch, and that's enough. It could be published. Who knows what could happen? I don't know that, but I do know that nothing will happen if you don't. And it's really honestly that first step. Now that's my big kind of sweeping kind of answer to that, right? If you've got the idea, put it down. Right. Now I'm going to tell you, and you kind of hinted at this earlier, and I'm so glad you did, because it's also not that simple. I really, especially with a comic, if a comic is the way you're going to go, there is a lot of work you got to put into it too. You can't, writing an idea down on a piece of paper, like you said, you mentioned this earlier, and then you hand that to an artist, they're going to want to strangle you because that's not the way it works. You got to put in some work ahead of time. You've got to double duty research, not only the actual logistical structure of how many times you hit tab for the sound effect label versus the timestamp label versus the piece of dialogue versus how you number it when you're on panel 7 but dialogue bubble 14. I mean, there's all these rules that make it readable and transferable in the industry to the actual storytelling pace and structure, which is unlike any other type of writing. It is not prose. It is not poetry. It is not stage play, teleplay. It is not script writing. It is comic writing, and it has its own pace and kind of general rules. Rules is not a great word for this because it is by far the most malleable media and can accept any type of story. That's what makes comics the best. Yeah. But there's definitely things that you've got to be aware of as you're writing, or it's just not going to translate into what you see in your head as a comic book.
I love that. That's some really good advice. Both parts. If you're out there trying to write a book, listen to that. So Jason, tell people where they can find your books and how they can support you.
Okay, absolutely. Thank you. So it's really easy to get Parallel right now. It was a weird release schedule because I was in previews, which, oh my God, talk about the nerd in me. I flipped that open and it was like in previews. Are you kidding me? Every month I've got it in my hand going, ooh, and then there it was. I almost fainted. It was in previews in February, and then Diamond shut down, and so Diamond didn't get their copies into shop until the summer, and Source Point sent theirs out even earlier. So it's been like this weird staggered release, but it's never been easier to get it right now. If you want to support an indie creator, an indie publisher, where your dollar goes so much further. This is not shade at Marvel or DC, but like, 64 pages and only $7, like that's like buying 100 copies of Wolverine number whatever.
Right.
Okay. It goes so much further because of the smallness and the small business nature of indie publishing. Number one, you walk into your shop, your local comic shop, if you can, and they might have it. Great. If they don't, all you got to do, you can say SourcePoint, you can say Jason Douglas, you can say Parallel, whatever you want to do, but the Diamond order code is still valid. They're doing reorders right now. SourcePoint's refilling them. Diamond's doing it. And the order code's super easy. It's FEB20 1983. Super easy to remember because that's the year Return of the Jedi came out. Okay? FEB20 1983. They'll order you a copy. Now, if for whatever reason your shop does not want your business, or you don't have a local shop, or you can't safely get to one right now, like whatever your circumstances is, you just go to sourcepointpress.com and you look up Parallel there, and they've got very reasonable shipping rates, and they'll send you one. Now, for my super nerds out there, I also had, oh my God, I have a hard time even digesting that this exists, but like, okay, so this was enough. Like this existing in the world, okay, crazy. But
you got variant covers.
There's a variant. This is the Garner variant. There's still a few of these left. There was only 100. This is through Sanctum Sanctorum Comics and Oddities. Very cool cover. The shattered glass at 2 different landings on there.
Yeah.
There's a direct link in my bio at Instagram. Come follow me at Instagram at J Douglas Writes. Say hello. Give me a follow. There's a direct link to that, and there are only a few of those left. Also on Instagram, I am not a famous person, and I am not. I will never big time you. So you've got a question that didn't get answered today, come and drop me a DM and I will answer it. There is precedent that you're asking me questions and you're like, oh, I don't want to bother you, and I will answer back. And I literally have got people in the past couple of months who are like, listen, I've got to go. Thanks for your time. And they're like cutting me off because I will talk to you. I will talk to you. By the way, here's my offer. So Instagram is really like my own social media because I am a teacher during the daytime, and playing around on social media is a good way for a teacher to get fired. So Instagram is my only account. Come and see me there at J Douglas Writes. If you get a copy of Parallel, right, whether SourcePoint ships it to you or you get it at your shop, whatever, as soon as it's in your hands, you take a picture of you in the book, you send it to me, and I will give you a shout out on Instagram. I'll send some followers your way, give you the props that you deserve. I love doing that. Now, before we go, I got to show you this.
Yeah.
This doesn't do me any good because these are sold out. But not only do I have the one variant with a couple extra copies, but then they made these.
Yeah, I love that one.
And those are gorgeous. The Donnie Darko homage variant. Look at the little guitars coming out where the bunny ear should be. Now this is the trade dress. There were 200 of these. These are gone. They pop up on eBay every once in a while. We did a giveaway through SourcePoint a couple of weeks ago. I'm thinking about giveaway with my copy sometime in the next couple of months. So be aware of that. And then there was a virgin foil variant.
Oh wow, I didn't see that one.
The store gifted me this slab, because this is my first slab comic.
Wow.
Which is kind of gorgeous too.
Yeah.
These have popped up on eBay too. Those are for a pretty penny. But if you want a copy of the book, very easy. Just go to your shop, FEB20 1983, or go to SourcePoint and they'll get you one. And then let me know when you get it so I can give you a shout out, okay?
Nice. Jason, thank you so much for being here today. I have so enjoyed this conversation. Guys, you heard where to get his book. Go get it. Support your local shop if you can, but if you can't get it there, SourcePoint Press, you can order it there also. Jason, thank you again.
It was my pleasure. It was truly an honor being on. This was a lot of fun.
Great.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. We'll see you next time.